Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Municipalists by Seth. Then with the gracious tone of an adult who has decided to include a child in a serious conversation, he pointed towards some numbers in the upper right-hand corner of the man's legal pad and asked me to take a look at them. 1,000, 2,100, 1,000, 2,100, 1,000, 2,100, 1,000, 2,100, 1,000, 1,730, 1,000, 1,730. When I wasn't able to make sense of them, he looked pleased with himself and suggested that they were most likely a series of durations written in military time. 10 a.m. to 9 p.m. Monday through Thursday. 10 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. Friday and Saturday. Null on Sundays. Those are the hours of operation of almost every public building in the city. Now look over here. He pointed to a pair of sketches at the bottom of the page. One was an arrangement of adjacent squares that created a horseshoe pattern, while the other was just a progression of intersecting lines marked with a series of X's. I checked that pattern of squares against the floor plan of every government-owned building in the city. The scale is off, but I'm pretty sure this is the first floor of the Metropolis Museum of History. He pointed to the second sketch. These X's matched the route for the Civic Pride Parade this Sunday, which will be passing one block north of the museum, closing down the surrounding streets. Yes, on a day that the museum itself will be closed. He looked at me as if the conclusions to be drawn from this were too obvious to mention, though when I asked him what it all meant, he shrugged. "Oh, I have no idea," he said, "but if Biggs was interested in the history museum, then so are we." The Metropolis Museum of History, METMO for short, is a beautiful 10-story building at the head of Adelman Park in Center City. It serves as the focal point of what is informally referred to as the Museum District, a 15-block radius containing a dozen of the city's best cultural centers, home to some of the world's most beloved displays of art, science, and history. The METMO is by far the largest, with over 300 exhibition halls featuring reconstructions of whole city streets as they appeared in bygone eras, as well as a constantly changing array of the museum's over 400,000 cultural artifacts, including everything from Arthur Tyler's upright bass to the mummified remains of Spanker, a French spaniel that belonged to the city's first colonial mayor. The building itself is also a notable work of art, the last to be designed by that great American Renaissance man Charles L. Weber. Its wide apron of granite steps leads up to a large portico with high vaulted ceilings and columns with neoclassical reliefs depicting prominent citizens of Metropolis throughout history. Visages of former politicians and social reformers who had clashed angrily in real life now stand arm in arm, smiling serenely at patrons as they enter the museum. Owen and I were staked out in the natural history exhibit on the first floor, watching the crowds for any suspicious activity. The hall was a large rotunda with its walls covered in smoky murals of ancient forests and marshes. Arranged throughout the space were platforms bearing stuffed elk and mountain lions, along with the elaborate recreations of the area's ancient megafauna. A stampede of life-sized mastodons dominated the center of the room. Nearby, a massive, short-faced bear glowered at nothing, while toward the grand entrance a 6-foot-long giant beaver was frozen with alarm as if it had stumbled upon the museum patrons in a clearing. It was one of METMO's most iconic spaces, encapsulating the grand drama of the place as a whole and reminding visitors of the city's transformation from coastal forest to cultural epicenter. It was also positioned just off the main entrance on the first floor so that all visitors were required to walk through it before branching off into the other exhibits. I have been skeptical about the idea of a stakeout, but Owen insisted. After entering the exhibit as museum guards, we found a nice location in one of the many blind spots of the museum's surveillance cameras. Across from us was also a surprisingly graphic display of a moose giving birth, which was driving enough patrons away from our general area that we were able to get settled without anyone noticing. Owen was inspired by the impressive appearance of some of the megafauna and so disguised us as a fake species of giant skunk that he named Mephatus giganteus. He brought up a low platform around us along with what he determined to be that skunk's ideal life-shrouded habitat, allowing us to scrutinize the flow of patrons from the museum into the museum. Hours passed and we still hadn't seen anything out of the ordinary. Dozens of children were led through the hall by nervous school teachers busy making sure their students were paying attention to the docents. Since Sarah Laurie's disappearance was still properly regarded as a kidnapping, many of the children were made to wear plastic whistles that hung from their necks with string. Every so often, a child would blow experimentally into his or her whistle and consequently receive a sharp whispered reprimand. There was also the expected throng of tourists as well as young couples out on lunch dates, using the more peculiar dioramas as an excuse to tap one another gently on the arm and point. There were the art students who sat on the low mahogany benches making sketches, and finally the dozens of elderly patrons who had only come to the museum for the exercise, pairs of them walking in slow, aimless circles. Owen's capacity for detective work had been quite impressive earlier that morning, but perhaps because his social intelligence was still developing, his ability to draw helpful conclusions from his district observations of the museum patrons seemed limited. He was intensely suspicious of the elderly patrons, a fact that became apparent when two women in their 70s power walked by our habitat. They were looking straight ahead, focusing on their low-impact cardio. Owen perceived this lack of interest in the museum's displays, along with their expressions of grim resolve, as indications that they were up to something diabolical. He was also wary of two young boys who had broken off from their class and stopped in front of the moose berth. They were leaning on the velvet rope surrounding the scene and howling with laughter. 2:00, Owen said, waving his snout toward the boys. I've got some patrons acting strangely. They're just kids, Owen. Solitaries use kids all the time. They give them and turn them into killing machines. Don't you read the news? Is there anything to suggest they're working for terrorists besides the fact that they're children? Well, somebody must have given them drugs at least, Owen said. They're laughing at that moose, but there's nothing funny about it. The artist rendered it perfectly. That's normal, Owen. Kids think bodies are funny. There was a prolonged silence in which I could feel Owen looking at the moose and straining to see the humor in it. He was eventually distracted by the return of Gunarius as they completed their circuit around the hall and slowly approached our position. They stopped 20 feet away and began bickering while one rifled through the other's bright purple fanny pack. Owen was no longer bothering to maintain the integrity of his disguise and was now watching the two with his eyes wide and his skunk's nostrils flared. He seemed certain that one of them was about to reach into the pack and produce a hand grenade. Get ready to tackle those two, he said. I whispered for him to get a hold of himself, but he was already counting down from 3. Unfortunately, that was when a tall man in a black agency suit entered the hall. He took a steno pad from his jacket and started to look up unabashedly at the museum security cameras, taking notes. The Septuagenarians had resolved their argument and now appeared to be dividing an assortment of vitamin supplements between the two of them. Owen, I said, over there. Don't worry, he said, keeping his eyes fixed on the woman. I see them. No, over there. The man in the dark suit was now tucking his notepad back into his jacket and walking toward the exhibit on the Dutch fur trade. Oh, him, Owen said. He seemed reluctant to give up his suspicion of the woman, so there was no little disappointment in his voice when he recognized that the man I'd spotted was clearly suspect. Once we were certain no eyes were on our display, Owen turned us back into guards and we headed over to the fur trade exhibit, where the man in the black suit was already taking the stairs up to the next floor. We half ran through the crowds gathered around reproductions of beaver felt hats and rusted muskets, then crept up the single flight of broad and rusted muskets, then crept up the single flight of road cast stone steps after him. Heavy black drapes hung over the next exhibit's entryway, and after I pushed my way through, we found ourselves surrounded by photographs of 1970s Metropolis, vandalized subway cars strewn with garbage, burned out buildings, a group of children playing on the roof of an abandoned car. We slowed down and pretended to browse when we saw that the man had stopped in the middle of the room to take more notes. A sign near the exhibit's entrance labeled it The Forgotten City. That's it for part 10. Thank you everybody so much for coming. I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.